The thunder rolled across the Montana sky like a warning as Nora Bennett stumbled forward, her hands clutching her swollen belly as if it were all she had left in the world, and perhaps it was. The year was 1875, and the mud beneath her feet seemed determined to claim her as she fled from the only home she had ever known, her father's final words still ringing in her ears. "No daughter of mine bears a bastard child under my roof." Rain pelted her face, mingling with the tears she could no longer distinguish as she slipped and fell to her knees in the thick, unforgiving mud. Her simple cotton dress, once white but now stained brown, clung to her shivering body. 6 months pregnant, exhausted, and with nowhere to go, Nora felt the last of her strength ebbing away. The small town of Willow Creek had turned its back on her the moment her condition became impossible to hide. "Please," she whispered to no one, her hand reaching out to brace herself against the muddy ground. "Please." The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through the downpour. She didn't look up, assuming it was just another townsperson who would avert their eyes and hurry past the fallen woman, the schoolteacher who had disgraced herself and her family, but the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. "Madam, are you all right?" A deep voice cut through the rain. Nora looked up, raindrops clinging to her long eyelashes. Through the gloom, she made out the silhouette of a man atop a large chestnut horse. His wide-brimmed hat offered little protection against the deluge, but he seemed unbothered by the water streaming down his face. "I'm fine," she lied, struggling to stand, her pride still intact despite everything. But her trembling legs betrayed her, and she slipped back into the mud with a pained gasp. Without hesitation, the stranger dismounted, his boots making a squelching sound as they hit the mud. He moved toward her with purpose, and for a moment Nora felt a flicker of fear. Men had not proven themselves worthy of trust in her experience. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice softer now as he knelt beside her. In the fading light she could see his face weathered but not unkind, with eyes the color of the summer sky. "Let me help you." "You don't understand," Nora said, her voice breaking. "They don't want me here anymore. My father, my kin, they've cast me out." Understanding dawned in the man's eyes as they briefly flickered to her swollen belly. Instead of the judgment she expected, his expression softened further. "The name's Caleb Everett," he said, extending a work-roughened hand, "and I don't much care what anyone else thinks. You need shelter, and I've got a cabin not far from here." Nora hesitated, her hand hovering above his. "Why would you help someone like me?" A sad smile touched his lips. "Because someone once did the same for me when I needed it most." Without waiting for her to accept, he gently slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her from the mud as if she weighed nothing at all. "I promise you shelter, madam, at least until you figure out your next steps." As he carried her to his horse, Nora Bennett felt something she had not expected to feel again: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, blooming in her chest like a wildflower after a drought. "Nora," she whispered as he carefully helped her onto his horse. "Nora Bennett." "Well, Miss Bennett," Caleb said, mounting the horse behind her, his arms forming a protective circle around her as he took the reins. "Let's get you somewhere warm." They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the rain softening to a gentle patter. Nora's body gradually relaxed against the solid warmth of the stranger behind her. She had been so cold for so long, not just from the rain but from the icy contempt in her father's eyes when he discovered her condition. "How far?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "Not much farther," Caleb assured her. "My cabin's just beyond those trees. It's not much, but it's dry and warm." As they crested a small hill, Nora caught sight of a modest cabin nestled among tall pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. A small corral stood empty to one side, and beyond that she could make out the shapes of cattle grazing despite the weather. "You live here alone?" she asked, unable to mask the caution in her voice. Caleb nodded, his chin brushing against her damp hair. "Just me and the cattle." Been that way for 3 years now. He guided his horse to a small stable attached to the cabin, dismounting first before carefully helping Nora down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, and Caleb's strong hands steadied her without comment. "Let's get you inside," he said, leading her to the cabin door. The interior was simple but a far cry from what Nora had expected of a bachelor's quarters. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across a small wooden table, 2 chairs, a modest kitchen area, and a bed tucked into the corner. A colorful quilt was folded at the foot of the bed, the only decorative touch in the otherwise utilitarian space. "You can take the bed," Caleb said, closing the door behind them. "I'll sleep by the fire." Nora stood dripping on the wooden floor, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will," he replied firmly, moving to a trunk at the foot of the bed. He pulled out a clean shirt and pair of trousers. "These will be too big, but they're dry. You can change behind that screen." He nodded toward a wooden partition in the corner. "I'll fix us something to eat." Too exhausted to argue, Nora took the offered clothes and made her way behind the screen. She peeled off her sodden dress with difficulty, her swollen belly making the task more challenging than it should have been. Caleb's shirt hung like a tent on her frame, but it was soft from many washings and smelled of pine and open air. When she emerged, Caleb was stirring something in a pot over the fire, his back to her. He had removed his wet coat and hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Feel better?" he asked without turning. "Yes, thank you." Nora sat carefully on one of the wooden chairs, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Caleb turned then, a bowl of stew in each hand. "No need for repayment, just eat something. You're feeding too now." The simple acknowledgement of her pregnancy without judgment brought unexpected tears to Nora's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, accepting the bowl with murmured thanks. They ate in comfortable silence, the stew warming Nora from the inside. It was simple fare beans, potatoes, and what tasted like venison, but to her it was a feast. "How long?" Caleb asked after a while, nodding toward her belly. "About 6 months, I think," Nora replied, her spoon pausing midway to her mouth. "The baby should come in late January." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "Winter births are tough, but we'll make sure you're both taken care of." Nora looked up sharply. "Mr. Everett, I appreciate your help tonight, but I can't impose on you indefinitely. Once the rain stops, and where will you go?" he interrupted gently. "Back to town where they cast you out. To the next town where they'll ask questions you don't want to answer." He set his empty bowl aside. "Winter's coming, Miss Bennett. These mountains are no place for a woman in your condition to wander alone." Nora wanted to protest further, but the truth of his words silenced her. She had nowhere to go, no money, no friends who would defy her father's declaration that she was dead to the family. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "My sister," he finally said, his voice low. "She found herself in a similar situation 5 years ago. The man who promised to marry her disappeared when he learned she was with child. Our father threw her out and he swallowed hard. She didn't survive the winter, nor did her baby. I was away driving cattle to Kansas City. By the time I returned, it was too late." The weight of his loss hung heavy in the room. Nora set her bowl down, her appetite gone. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "So am I," Caleb replied, meeting her eyes. "Which is why you'll stay here at least until your child is born and you're strong enough to travel. After that, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Nora's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you." Caleb stood, breaking the moment. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out the details." As Nora settled into Caleb's bed, wrapped in the colorful quilt that she now noticed was pieced together with careful, loving stitches, she watched him arrange a bedroll near the fire. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a gentle patter of water dripping from the eaves. "Mr. Everett," she called softly. He paused in his preparations. "Caleb, please." "Caleb," she amended. Thank you for lifting me out of the mud today." A small smile touched his lips. "Get some rest, Miss Bennett." "Nora," she corrected, her eyelids already growing heavy. "Just Nora." The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn to tend to his cattle and the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. Nora, despite his protests that she should rest, insisted on making herself useful by taking over the cooking and keeping the cabin tidy. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she told him firmly on the third morning when he suggested she stay in bed. "And I won't be a burden." Caleb, recognizing the determination in her blue-gray eyes, had simply nodded. "At least let me know if you need help." As October deepened into November, the mountains became touched with frost each morning. Caleb spent long days reinforcing the cattle pen, stocking firewood, and making repairs to the cabin. Nora noticed that he was preparing not just for winter, but for her confinement. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Nora found the courage to ask about something that had been weighing on her mind. "The quilt on the bed," she began, her fingers working a piece of mending. "Did your sister make it?" Caleb looked up from the bridle he was repairing, surprise evident in his expression. "Yes, Hannah was always good with a needle. How did you know?" "The stitches," Nora explained. "They're too fine to be a man's work, yet you keep it so carefully." She hesitated. "It's all you have of her, isn't it?" Caleb set the bridle aside, his focus entirely on the dancing flames. "That and memories, some good, some that haunt me." He drew a deep breath. "I should have been there for her." "You didn't know," Nora said softly. "No, but I knew our father." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I knew what he was capable of, his unyielding views on propriety and family honor. I should have taken her with me when I left." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire. Nora set her mending aside and moved to sit beside him on the bench near the hearth. "What happened to Hannah wasn't your fault," she said. "Just as what happened to me wasn't my baby's fault." She placed a protective hand over her growing belly. "We can only move forward from where we stand." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the surface for the first time. "You're remarkably strong, Nora Bennett." She gave a small, sad laugh. "Not strong, just surviving. Sometimes that's the same thing." He hesitated before asking, "The father of your child?" "Does he know?" Nora's expression closed. "He knows. He made it clear he wants nothing to do with either of us." "A coward, then," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "A married man," Nora corrected, the admission causing her cheeks to flush with shame. "The town's new doctor, he told me his wife had died back east. I believed him until her arrival in Willow Creek made a liar of him and a fool of me." Caleb's expression softened. "That doesn't make you a fool, it makes him a liar and a scoundrel." "The town didn't see it that way," Nora said bitterly. "To them, I was the fallen schoolteacher who tried to steal another woman's husband. My father was forced to choose between his reputation and his daughter." She looked down at her hands. "He chose as most men would, I suppose." "Not all men," Caleb said quietly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared pain and resilience. Nora was the first to look away, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth radiating from him that had nothing to do with the fire. "I should check on the stew," she said, rising awkwardly due to her growing belly. Caleb stood to help her, his hand gentle on her elbow. "Nora," he said, his voice low, "you and your child are welcome here for as long as you want to stay. I want you to know that." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tighten. "Thank you," she managed before retreating to the safety of the small kitchen area. That night, as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows, Nora lay awake in Caleb's bed, listening to his steady breathing across the room. She wondered at the twist of fate that had brought her, broken and desperate, to the doorstep of perhaps the only man for 50 miles who wouldn't judge her for her past mistakes. She placed both hands on her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her touch. "We might be okay," she whispered to her unborn child. "We just might be okay." The first major snowfall came 2 weeks later, blanketing the mountains in white and effectively isolating the cabin from the nearest town. Caleb had made a trip to the general store in Willow Creek just before the snow, careful to avoid any mention of his house guest. He returned with supplies that would see them through at least part of the winter flour: sugar, coffee, dried fruits, and a bolt of soft flannel that he presented to Nora with uncharacteristic shyness. "For the baby," he explained, watching as she ran her fingers over the pale yellow fabric. I thought you might want to make some things." Nora was touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, thank you." As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, they settled into a comfortable routine. Caleb spent the mornings tending to the animals and hunting when weather permitted, while Nora kept the cabin warm and prepared meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Caleb whittling or repairing equipment, Nora sewing small garments from the flannel. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories from their lives before. Nora learned that Caleb had fought briefly for the Union during the final year of the Civil War, despite being only 17 at the time. He drifted westward afterward, working cattle drives and ranch jobs until he saved enough to buy his own small spread 3 years ago. "It's not much compared to the big ranches," he told her one evening, "but it's mine, free and clear. No one can take it from me." In turn, Nora shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her training as a teacher, and her journey west 2 years earlier to take the position in Willow Creek. "I wanted adventure," she said with a rueful smile, her hands busy with the tiny shirt she was stitching. "My mother warned me I'd find nothing but hardship out west, but I was determined to prove her wrong." "And now?" Caleb asked, pausing in his whittling to look at her. Nora considered the question, her hand coming to rest on her belly. "Now I think perhaps we were both right. There's hardship here, yes, but also beauty and possibility I never would have known in Philadelphia." What she didn't say, what she couldn't bring herself to admit aloud, was that she was beginning to find unexpected joy in their shared life at the cabin. The way Caleb smiled when she mastered a new recipe. The gentle consideration he showed her, always ensuring she had the warmest spot by the fire, the most comfortable chair. The sound of his deep voice reading aloud from one of his few books in the evening. These small moments were weaving themselves into something dangerous: hope. Yes, but also affection that went beyond gratitude. December arrived with bitter cold that crept through every crack in the cabin's walls. Caleb spent a day sealing the gaps with mud and moss while Nora kept the fire blazing. That night, exhausted from his efforts, he fell asleep in the chair by the hearth, his book open on his lap. Nora watched him for a moment, noting the way the firelight played across his features, softening the lines that hard work and loss had etched there. Without thinking, she reached for the quilt and gently draped it over him. As she tucked it around his shoulders, his eyes opened, catching her in the act. "Sorry," she whispered, stepping back. "You looked cold." Caleb caught her hand before she could retreat further. "Nora," he said, his voice rough with sleep, "you don't have to take care of me." "I know," she replied. "I want to." The admission hung between them, simple yet profound. Caleb's thumb brushed across her knuckles, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "You should rest," he said finally, releasing her hand. "The baby needs it." Nora nodded, suddenly unable to trust her voice. She retreated to the bed, but sleep eluded her as she replayed the moment in her mind, the warmth of his hand around hers, the intensity in his eyes. The baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing her restlessness. "Hush now," she murmured, running a soothing hand over her belly. Everything's all right, but she wasn't entirely convinced of that herself. The next morning, Caleb was gone before Nora awoke, leaving only a note saying he'd gone to check on the cattle in the lower pasture and would return by midday. The day stretched on, however, with no sign of him. As afternoon faded to evening and the first snowflakes began to fall, Nora's concern grew to fear. She stood by the window, straining to see through the increasing snowfall. What if he was hurt? lost. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the storm looked to be worsening. Just as she was contemplating the impossible task of searching for him, she spotted movement at the edge of the trees. Relief flooded through her as Caleb emerged from the forest, leading his horse. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. He was limping badly, leaning heavily on the horse for support. Nora threw a shawl around her shoulders and hurried outside, heedless of the snow and cold. "Caleb," she called, wading through the deepening snow to reach him. His face was pale beneath his tan, lines of pain etched around his mouth. "I'm all right," he tried to assure her, but the words were belied by the way he swayed on his feet. "You're not," Nora said firmly, ducking under his arm to support him. "Lean on me." "Can't," he grunted. "Too heavy, and in your condition, lean on me," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Or we'll both freeze out here arguing about it." With a half-smile that looked more like a grimace, Caleb complied, allowing her to help him toward the cabin while the horse followed obediently behind. Once inside, Nora eased him into the chair by the fire before hurrying to tend to the horse. When she returned, Caleb was attempting to remove his boot, his face gray with pain. "Stop that," she scolded, kneeling before him. "Let me." Gently she eased the boot from his foot, revealing an ankle already swollen to twice its normal size. "What happened?" "Stepped in a rabbit hole hidden by snow," Caleb explained through gritted teeth. "Horse spooked at a rattler, rare to see one out in this cold, but not unheard of. When I fell, my foot twisted." Nora probed the injury with careful fingers, relieved to find no obvious break. "A bad sprain, I think." "You're fortunate it's not worse." She worked efficiently, soaking a cloth in cold water from the bucket and wrapping it around his ankle before elevating his foot on a stool. "Keep it like this. I'll make some willow bark tea for the pain." As she moved about the cabin, gathering what she needed, she felt Caleb's eyes following her. "You seem to know what you're doing," he observed. "My mother was a midwife," Nora explained, measuring dried willow bark into a pot of water. "She taught me a few things about tending to injuries and illnesses. It comes in handy when you're teaching a room full of children prone to scrapes and fevers." She brought him the tea once it had steeped, along with a plate of the stew she'd kept warm for his return. "Drink this, then eat. The bark will help with the pain and swelling." Caleb took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "For coming out in the snow, for helping me back." "Well," she said lightly, trying to dispel the sudden tension between them, "I couldn't very well let you freeze out there. Who would chop the firewood?" Her attempt at humor earned her a smile, but there was something else in his expression, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. "You're remarkable, Nora Bennett," he said softly. She felt her cheeks flush and busied herself with adjusting the cloth on his ankle. "Drink your tea before it gets cold," she instructed, unable to meet his eyes. "And mind you keep that foot elevated." For the next few days, their roles were reversed, with Nora handling the outside chores while Caleb was confined to the cabin. He chafed at the inactivity, particularly as the days until Christmas and Nora's confinement dwindled. "I should be preparing," he muttered on the third day, watching from the chair as Nora returned from feeding the cattle, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "There's still wood to be chopped, meat to be smoked, and all of it can wait until your ankle heals," Nora interrupted, hanging her shawl by the door. "You'll do yourself no favors by rushing back out there too soon." She moved to check his ankle, which was still swollen but improving. As she knelt to replace the wrapping, she felt a sharp pain in her lower back, followed by a strange, tightening sensation across her abdomen. She gasped, one hand flying to her belly. Caleb was immediately alert, his own discomfort forgotten. "Nora, what is it?" "Nothing," she assured him, breathing through the pain until it passed. "Just a twinge. The baby's been active today." But Caleb wasn't convinced. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on her belly. "Are you sure?" "It's still early, but I'm sure," Nora said, though the certainty in her voice was forced. It's past now. Caleb's hand remained on hers, warm and strong. "Promise me you'll rest," he said, his eyes searching hers. "No more outside chores today." "Only if you promise to stop fretting," she countered, attempting a smile. "Between the two of us, we're doing a fine job of worrying about each other." His expression softened, and his thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand. "I suppose we are." The moment stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. Nora was acutely aware of his nearness, of the rough warmth of his hand over hers, of the way his eyes had darkened to the color of a summer storm. The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, directly beneath their joined hands. Caleb's eyes widened in wonder. Was that? Nora nodded, unable to suppress a smile at his expression. Yes, he or she has been doing somersaults all day. Without thinking, she moved his hand to a different spot on her belly. "Wait, there, feel that." Caleb's face transformed with awe as he felt another kick. "That's incredible," he breathed, his gaze moving from her belly to her face. "You're incredible." The naked admiration in his eyes made Nora's heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. She suddenly realized how intimate the moment was, his hand on her belly, her hand guiding his, their faces close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "I should start dinner," she said, breaking the spell as she carefully rose to her feet. Caleb let his hand fall away, something unreadable passing across his features. "Of course." As she busied herself at the small stove, Nora tried to make sense of the emotions swirling within her. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something that frightened her with its intensity. She had trusted a man once before, opened her heart to him, and the result had been disaster. Yet Caleb Everett was nothing like Dr. James Wilson. Where James had been smooth, talking, and quick with flattery, Caleb was straightforward and honest. Where James had made grand promises he never intended to keep, Caleb simply acted, offering shelter, protection, kindness without expectation of return. The realization that she was falling in love with him struck her with the force of a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, suddenly lightheaded. "Nora," Caleb called, concern evident in his voice. "Are you all right?" She drew a steadying breath. "Fine," she managed, "just a bit tired." But as she continued preparing their meal, she knew that nothing was fine. She was carrying another man's child, dependent on Caleb's charity, and had nothing to offer him but complications. The growing feelings in her heart would have to remain there, unspoken. It was the only way to protect both of them from inevitable heartbreak. Christmas arrived with a brief respite from the snow, allowing sunlight to sparkle off the white landscape surrounding the cabin. Caleb's ankle had improved enough that he could move about with the aid of a makeshift crutch he'd fashioned from a tree branch. Despite Nora's protests, he insisted on handling the morning chores. "It's Christmas," he told her firmly. "And you've done more than your share this past week." When he returned from tending the animals, he found Nora placing pine boughs around the cabin, their fresh scent filling the air. She had also hung small bundles of dried berries she'd gathered in the fall, giving the simple space a festive appearance. "It's not much," she said apologetically when she noticed him watching. "But I wanted to make it feel like Christmas, at least a little." "It's perfect," Caleb assured her, his eyes warm as they took in her efforts. After breakfast, Caleb surprised her by producing a small, carefully wrapped package from his coat pocket. "Merry Christmas," he said, holding it out to her with an uncharacteristic hint of nervousness. Nora took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "Caleb, you didn't have to, I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "Open it." Inside the wrapping, she found a small wooden box beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play, a lullaby she recognized from her own childhood. "A music box," she breathed, watching the tiny mechanism turn. "It's beautiful. I thought," Caleb said, his voice low, "that you might like something to help the baby sleep when the time comes." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the fact that he had somehow obtained it without her knowledge, and most of all, the clear indication that he had been thinking of her child's future. It was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, cradling the box as carefully as she would an infant. "I have something for you too, though it's nowhere near as fine." She retrieved a package from beneath the bed and handed it to him, suddenly shy. "It's not much." Caleb unwrapped it to find a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, along with a pair of matching gloves. "Nora," he said, running his fingers over the even stitches, "when did you find time for this?" "While you were sleeping, mostly," she admitted. "Your old ones were so worn, and with winter being what it is." "They're perfect," he said, immediately wrapping the scarf around his neck. "No one has made anything for me since Hannah." He trailed off, emotion making his voice rough. Impulsively, Nora reached out and squeezed his hand. "Merry Christmas, Caleb." He turned his hand to capture hers, his calloused thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. "Merry Christmas, Nora." The day passed in quiet contentment. They shared a special meal of venison stew with the last of the summer vegetables Nora had preserved, followed by a small cake she'd managed to bake using precious sugar and dried fruits. As evening fell, they sat by the fire, the music box playing its gentle melody. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. Inside, the cabin was warm, fragrant with pine and the lingering sense of their Christmas dinner. "I never expected to be here," Nora said softly, her hands resting on her belly. "When my father threw me out, I thought." She swallowed hard. "I thought that was the end." Caleb's eyes were steady on her face. And now she met his gaze, allowing herself to acknowledge the truth. "Now I think perhaps it was a beginning." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening, a kindling of hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Nora gasped, her hands clutching her belly as a sharp pain tore through her. "Nora," alarm sharpened his voice as he moved to kneel beside her chair. "What is it?" "I don't know," she managed, breathing heavily as the pain receded. "It's too early." "The baby isn't due for weeks yet." But even as she spoke, another contraction seized her stronger than the first. Fear bloomed in her chest. "Caleb, something's wrong." His face paled, but his voice remained steady. "Let's get you to the bed. Can you walk?" She nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. They had taken only a few steps when she felt a rush of warm fluid down her legs. "Oh," she gasped, looking down in horror. "My waters." Caleb didn't hesitate. Despite his injured ankle, he swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, settling her gently on the mattress. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice calm despite the fear evident in his eyes. Nora fought through another contraction, trying to remember everything her mother had taught her about childbirth. "Clean cloths," she gasped, "hot water, and my sewing basket. There's a small knife there." As Caleb gathered the supplies, Nora tried to calculate how early the baby was coming. 7 months, a little more. She had heard of infants surviving when born early, but out here, miles from a doctor or midwife. "Please," she whispered, one hand pressed to her belly. "Please wait just a little longer," but her body had other ideas. The contractions were coming faster now, each one more intense than the last. By the time Caleb returned with the requested items, she was panting through another wave of pain. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. "I'm right here with you." Nora clung to his hand like a lifeline. "It's too early," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. "The baby's too small." Caleb brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Your baby is strong," he said firmly, "just like its mother. You can do this, Nora. I believe in you." Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Outside, the snow fell harder, driven by an increasing wind that howled around the cabin like a living thing. Inside, Nora fought the hardest battle of her life with Caleb as her steadfast ally. He never left her side, wiping her brow, offering water between contractions, murmuring encouragement when she thought she couldn't continue. When the time came to push, he positioned himself to help, his strong hands gentle as they prepared to receive the child. "I can see the head," he told her, wonder mingling with determination in his voice. "One more push, Nora, one more." Gathering her remaining strength, Nora bore down with everything she had. There was a moment of searing pain, followed by an indescribable sensation of release. And then, cutting through the howl of the blizzard outside, came a sound that stopped her heart, the thin, angry cry of a newborn. "A girl," Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion as he quickly wrapped the tiny infant in a clean cloth. "You have a daughter, Nora." He placed the baby on Nora's chest, and she looked down at the impossibly small face, red and wrinkled and perfect. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears flowing freely now. "You're early, but you're here." The baby's cries quieted as Nora held her close, instinctively seeking warmth and comfort. She was tiny, alarmingly so, but her lungs worked well enough, and her small hands curled into fists as if ready to fight for her place in the world. Caleb moved efficiently, cleaning up and ensuring Nora was comfortable before sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes never leaving the two of them. "She's beautiful," he said softly, "just like her mother." Nora looked up at him, seeing the emotion naked on his face. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't have done this without you." He reached out, one finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "What will you call her?" Nora hadn't thought about names, not seriously. It had seemed like tempting fate somehow. But looking at her daughter's face, at the man who had helped bring her into the world, she knew. "Hannah," she said, watching Caleb's expression. "Hannah Rose Bennett." She saw the impact of the name register in his eyes, which suddenly shone with unshed tears. "Nora, you don't have to, I want to," she interrupted gently. "If you don't mind. She seems like a fighter, like someone who wouldn't give up easily, like your sister." Caleb swallowed hard, nodding. "Hannah," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at the baby, then back at Nora, something shifting in his expression. "Nora, but whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by a fierce gust of wind that rattled the cabin windows, followed by the baby's renewed cries. The moment passed as they focused on settling little Hannah, getting her to nurse for the first time. The night deepened around them, the blizzard raging outside while inside the cabin. A new family, unexpected, unconventional, but no less real, took its first tentative breaths. The days following Hannah's birth were a blur of exhaustion, joy, and fear. The baby was so small, so fragile, that Nora hardly dared sleep for fear of missing some vital sign of distress. Caleb insisted on taking turns watching over them both, using his injured ankle as an excuse to stay close to the cabin rather than tending to outdoor chores. "The cattle can manage another day," he said when Nora protested. "You and Hannah need me more." It was during one of these vigils, as Nora dozed in the bed with Hannah nestled against her chest, that she woke to find Caleb watching them, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen before. There was tenderness there, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness and something deeper that made her heart skip. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. Caleb startled slightly, as if caught in a private moment. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "She's breathing well, strong little thing." Nora smiled, gently stroking Hannah's wispy dark hair. "She is, isn't she? I think she might have her Uncle Caleb's stubborn streak." Something flickered in his eyes at the word uncle, a brief shadow that was gone almost before she registered it. "She's lucky to have you for a mother," he said after a moment. "And you for a friend," Nora added. The word felt inadequate somehow, failing to encompass all that Caleb had become to her in the months since he'd lifted her from the mud. But what else could she call him? What right did she have to hope for more? Caleb rose from his chair by the bed, moving to add wood to the fire. "You should rest while she's sleeping," he said, his back to her. "The first weeks are the hardest, my mother always said." Nora watched him, noting the ease with which he moved now that his ankle was healing, the broad set of his shoulders beneath his woolen shirt, the careful way he arranged the logs to give the most heat. He had become so familiar to her, the sound of his breathing in the night, the scent of pine and leather that clung to him, the quiet strength in his hands. She closed her eyes, unwilling to examine too closely the feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. Hannah needed her full attention now. There would be time later to sort through the complicated tangle of emotions that Caleb Everett inspired. January passed in a haze of sleepless nights and quiet days. Hannah grew stronger by the day, her tiny body filling out, her cries becoming more insistent. Caleb's ankle healed completely, allowing him to resume his full range of duties around the ranch, though he still spent every spare moment with Nora and the baby. One evening in early February, as a rare clear sky allowed the stars to shine brilliant and cold above the snow-covered mountains, Caleb returned from checking the cattle with news. "Trail to town should be passable in a week or so," he said as he hung his coat by the door. First time since before Christmas. Nora looked up from where she sat nursing Hannah by the fire, a sudden weight settling in her chest. "Oh," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral, That's good news." Caleb moved to warm his hands by the fire, his eyes on the baby rather than meeting Nora's gaze. "Thought you might want to send word to your family. Let them know about Hannah." The suggestion stung more than it should have. "My father made his feelings quite clear," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Hannah and I are dead to him." Caleb frowned, finally looking at her. "He might feel differently now that she's here. Some men—" He hesitated. "Some men need time to accept things." "And some never do," Nora countered, remembering the cold fury in her father's eyes as he ordered her from his house. "Besides, Hannah and I have managed just fine without him." "You have," Caleb agreed, his expression softening as he looked at the baby. "She's thriving." There was pride in his voice, as if Hannah's progress was his own achievement. In many ways, Nora realized it was. Without his care, his shelter, his steady presence during her birth, Hannah might not have survived at all. "Thanks to you," she said softly. Caleb shook his head. "I just provided the roof. You did the hard part." "We both know that's not true." Nora adjusted Hannah, who had fallen asleep at her breast, and carefully covered herself. "You've been everything, Caleb, everything we needed." Their eyes met across the small space, and Nora felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever he looked at her that way, as if she were something precious, something to be cherished. "Nora," he began, his voice rough. "I've been thinking." A sudden cry from Hannah interrupted him. The baby had woken, her face scrunching in discomfort. Nora recognized the signs of colic that had been troubling her at night. "Oh, sweet girl," she murmured, rising to pace with the infant. "Shh, it's all right." Caleb watched for a moment before moving to the shelf where the music box sat. He wound it carefully and brought it to Nora, the gentle melody filling the cabin. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms for the baby. Nora hesitated only briefly before placing Hannah in his embrace. She watched as he cradled her daughter with practiced ease, swaying gently to the music, his deep voice humming along. Hannah's cries gradually subsided, her tiny face relaxing as she gazed up at Caleb with unfocused eyes. "There now," he murmured to the infant. "That's better, isn't it? Your mama needs rest too, you know." The sight of them together, Caleb's large, work-roughened hands holding Hannah with such tenderness, the baby responding to his voice as readily as she did to Nora's, created an ache in Nora's heart that was both sweet and painful. In that moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different reality, one where Hannah was Caleb's daughter by blood as well as by the bond that was clearly forming between them. One where Nora had the right to cross the room and lean against his strength, to be held as carefully as he held her child. But such thoughts were dangerous. Caleb had offered shelter, not a future. When spring came in earnest, she would need to make decisions about where to go, how to support herself and Hannah. The trail to town being passable was the first reminder that their time in this sheltered cocoon was limited. Reality waited beyond the snowdrifts, and Nora wasn't sure she was ready to face it. February gave way to March, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to recede from the southern slopes, and the days grew noticeably longer. Hannah was nearly 2 months old now, gaining weight steadily and beginning to focus on faces, even offering what Caleb insisted were real smiles rather than gas. "She knows exactly what she's doing," he argued one morning when Nora teased him about his certainty. "Look at that, that's a smile for her Uncle Caleb." The term had become his standard way of referring to himself in relation to Hannah, and while Nora never corrected him, each time he said it felt like a small reminder of the boundaries between them. On a particularly mild day, Caleb suggested they take Hannah outside for the first time. "Just for a few minutes," he said, already wrapping the baby in multiple layers despite Nora's amused protests. She should feel the sun on her face. They stood together in the dooryard, Hannah bundled against Nora's chest, all three of them blinking in the bright March sunshine. The world was a study in contrasts: white snow still deep in the shadows, patches of brown earth emerging on the sunny slopes, a hawk circling high above against the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," Nora breathed, filling her lungs with air that tasted of pine and melting snow and possibility. "Yes," Caleb agreed, but when she glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the landscape. His eyes were fixed on her face, warm with an emotion she was afraid to name. Hannah chose that moment to make a small sound of contentment, drawing both their attention. Caleb chuckled, gently stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. "I think she approves of the great outdoors." "Like her uncle," Nora said, the word feeling like a stone in her mouth. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. He took a step closer, close enough that Nora could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Nora," he said, his voice low, "I've been wanting to talk to you about something." Her heart began to race, hope and fear tangling in her chest. "Yes." "When you and Hannah are ready to leave," he began, and Nora felt her heart sink even as she chided herself for expecting anything else. But he continued, "I want you to know that you don't have to." She blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "Don't have to what? Leave?" Caleb's eyes were steady on hers, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Either of you, ever," Nora's breath caught. "Caleb, what are you saying?" He drew a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I'm saying that these past months with you and Hannah, they've been the best of my life. This cabin hasn't felt like a home since Hannah, my sister, died. But now," he gestured to the three of them standing in the sunshine, "now it does." Hope bloomed in Nora's chest, but caution held her back. "We're grateful for all you've done, more than I can ever express. But we can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." "It's not kindness, Nora." Frustration edged his voice. "Don't you see? I love having you here, both of you." The word love hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to address directly. "People would talk," Nora said weakly, her last defense crumbling. "A woman and her child living with a man who's not her husband." "Then marry me," Caleb said simply. Nora stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "What?" Caleb stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Marry me, Nora Bennett, not because of what people might say, but because I love you, because I love Hannah as if she were my own, because I want to build a life with you both." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, spilling over to track down her cheeks. Caleb gently wiped them away with his thumb. "I know it hasn't been long," he continued, his voice soft, "and I know you've been hurt before. If you need time, yes," Nora interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you, Caleb." Joy transformed his face, erasing the lingering uncertainty. "You will?" Nora nodded, shifting Hannah to one arm so she could reach up and touch his face. "I love you too," she admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I have for months now." Caleb's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. Nora responded in kind, her free hand sliding to the nape of his neck, drawing him closer. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Hannah made a small sound of protest at being squeezed between them. They laughed, the joy of the moment too great to be contained. "I think she approves," Caleb said, gently adjusting the baby's blanket. "Of course she does," Nora replied. "She's been trying to tell me for weeks that her Uncle Caleb should be her papa instead." Caleb's expression grew serious. "I would be honored to be her father, Nora, in every way that matters." "I know," Nora said softly. "That's why I love you." They stood together in the spring sunshine. A family formed not by blood but by choice, by love, by the promise of a future brighter than any of them could have imagined on that rainy day when a cowboy lifted a fallen woman from the mud and promised her shelter. Nora and Caleb were married in April, when the first wildflowers began to dot the meadows around the cabin. The ceremony was small, performed by the circuit preacher who visited Willow Creek once a month. Only a handful of Caleb's neighbors attended, along with the storekeeper and his wife who had always been kind to Nora during her time in town. Her father did not come, though Caleb had insisted on sending an invitation. He should have the chance to know his granddaughter, he had argued gently. And to see that his daughter is happy. The lack of response had stung, but less than Nora expected. She had a new family now, one built on acceptance and love rather than rigid expectations. After the simple ceremony, as guests enjoyed the wedding feast spread on tables outside the cabin, Caleb drew Nora aside, Hannah sleeping peacefully in a cradle he had carved for her. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Nora found a deed with both their names on it. "The ranch," Caleb explained. "It's ours now together. Whatever we build here, we build as partners." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes as she looked up at her husband. "Partners," she repeated, savoring the word and all it implied. "And there's something else." Caleb reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This came yesterday." Nora unfolded it to find a letter addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Everett in a familiar hand, her father's precise penmanship. "He didn't come," she said, confusion evident in her voice. "Write it," Caleb encouraged gently. The letter was brief but clear. Her father acknowledged the wedding invitation and expressed regret at his previous actions. He wrote of pride and foolishness, of the loneliness of the past months, and of his desire to meet his granddaughter when Nora felt ready to allow it. "He wants to reconcile," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb nodded, his arms slipping around her waist. "People can change, Nora. Sometimes they just need time to realize what truly matters." She leaned into his strength, watching their guests laughing and talking in the spring sunshine, Hannah sleeping peacefully nearby. "I have everything that matters right here," she said softly. "As do I," Caleb replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But family is family. When you're ready, we'll go see him together." Nora nodded, folding the letter carefully. There would be time for reconciliation, for healing old wounds. For now, she wanted to savor this perfect day, the beginning of their life together. As if sensing her thoughts, Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her waist. "Happy, Mrs. Everett?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Nora replied truthfully, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Their guests cheered good-naturedly, but neither Nora nor Caleb noticed. They were too absorbed in each other, in the promise of their future together, in the love that had grown from an act of kindness on a rainy day when a pregnant woman was cast into the mud, and a cowboy lifted her up and promised shelter. In the years that followed, the Everett Ranch prospered. Caleb's careful management and hard work expanded their herd, while Nora established a small school in a converted barn on their property, teaching not only Hannah but the children of neighboring ranchers. Hannah grew into a strong, spirited girl with her mother's blue-gray eyes and a determination that both parents recognized as uniquely her own. She never questioned why her last name was Everett rather than Bennett to her. Caleb was simply Papa, the center of her world alongside her mother. When Hannah was 3, she gained a brother, Samuel Caleb Everett, born on a clear autumn night with considerably less drama than his sister's arrival. 2 years later, twin girls joined the family, Elizabeth and Emma, with their father's blue eyes and their mother's gentle smile. The cabin grew as the family did, with Caleb adding rooms and eventually building a proper house nearby. though they kept the original cabin as a reminder of where their story began. Nora reconciled with her father, who became a doting grandfather to all 4 children. The bitterness of the past faded with time, replaced by an understanding that family bonds, though sometimes strained, were resilient when nurtured with forgiveness and love. On the 10th anniversary of the day Caleb found Nora in the mud, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the meadow where wildflowers nodded in the summer breeze. "You ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Nora asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "If you hadn't ridden by that day or if you'd kept going." Caleb's arm tightened around her waist. "I couldn't have kept going," he said simply. "Not when I saw you there. Something inside me just knew." Nora smiled, turning in his embrace to look up at him. A decade of Montana sun and wind had weathered his face, and there were strands of silver now at his temples, but his eyes were the same clear and blue as the summer sky, filled with the same tenderness that had given her hope when she needed it most. "Knew what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "That you were my future," Caleb replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "You and Hannah, that I'd found my way home even though I didn't realize I was lost." Nora reached up to touch his face, marveling still at the journey that had brought them here. "I love you, Caleb Everett," she said softly, "more with each passing day." "And I love you," he replied, bending to kiss her with the same gentle passion that had sustained them through a decade of joy and hardship, triumph and challenge. Always. From the meadow came the sound of children's laughter, bright and clear in the summer air. Nora and Caleb turned to watch as Hannah, now a leggy 10-year-old, led her siblings in a game of tag among the wildflowers. Life had not always been easy. There had been harsh winters, failed crops, illnesses that brought fear in the night. But through it all, they had faced each challenge together, their love a shelter stronger than any walls of wood or stone. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the circumstances that had brought them together, but the choice they made each day to build a life worthy of that chance encounter in the rain. A life of purpose and meaning, of love freely given and gratefully received. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Caleb took Nora's hand in his. Together, they walked down the porch steps to join their children in the meadow, moving toward the sound of laughter that called them home. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, Nora knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the darkest days could lead to the brightest futures. That sometimes being cast out was really being set free. That sometimes, when a hand reached down to lift you from the mud, it was offering not just shelter but a whole new life. A life beyond anything she could have imagined on that rainy day so long ago, when a pregnant woman was cast into the mud by kin, and a cowboy lifted her up and promised shelter.